Hey, okay, now we're continuing on with chapter 1. We're talking about who sets the standards for governmental and not-for-profit accounting. So there's rules, right? So when you were learning intermediate, you learned the Financial Accounting Standards Board creates these accounting rules, and that's what we follow. That's how we know when to recognize revenue, how to accrue expenses, right? So they tell us the rules. Well, there's standard setters for governmental and not-for-profit accounting too, and depends a little bit on who you are, right? So if you think about it, the U.S. government is its own entity, right? It's not like somebody can make a rule and force the United States to follow it. They're like the top of the food chain, and they're a sovereign nation, right? So who exists are the FASAB, which is the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board, and they give advice about financial accounting standards for the federal government. And these are implemented through the GAO, the Treasury Department, the OMB, but there's a set of standards compiled by this FASAB, and that's what the federal government follows. Now, I would never expect you to, memorize standards and things like that, but understand who makes the standards. So federal government has its own separate standard maker, and then the government kind of decides, yeah, we'll do that, or we don't like that, and come up with a different standard, right? Because they run everything in this country. All right. Next is the GASB. All right, so you may have heard of GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board. They create standards for state and local governments. All right, so they're a little separate from the FASAB because federal is separate from state and local. So a lot of what we're talking about are going to be, city, county, local type rules. So the university, we would follow GASB because we're a state entity. So GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board. And then if you are doing the accounting for a not-for-profit, a hospital, the SPCA, any kind of not-for-profit, the accounting society here at A&M Kingsville, any kind of private not-for-profit, they would use standards that are published by FASB, the very same entity that promulgates the standards for financial accounting for corporations and sole proprietorship. So the very same entity that creates U.S. GAAP for companies creates GAAP for not-for-profits. It's not the same. It's slightly different, but it's the same entity. They just have some different standards. All right. Now, so obviously there's going to be, just like with U.S. GAAP for profit organizations, for not-for-profit and governmental organizations, there's some literature out there that people follow, and some of it's what's called authoritative, and some of it is not authoritative. In other words, you can't rely on it as the rule, right? So the authoritative sources for generally accepted accounting principles for state and local government is GASB statements and interpretations of those statements. All right, so there's a lot of literature out there, but if you end up being the accountant for City of Kingsville, you have to follow the GASB statements. And if GASB has put out interpretations of those statements, you can follow those interpretations. Now, you can imagine the wide variety of governmental entities that exist, and sub-entities. And right, there's the state of Texas, but A&M Kingsville is part of the state of Texas, right? And then there's some entity within the A&M Kingsville, like for example, the Wildlife Center They may have their own financial reporting, right? So there may not be perfect standards for everything, in which case you may want to turn to implementation guides, technical bulletins, AICPA, information cleared by GASB. So here's how it works. If you're the accountant for, say, a city or a state entity, you're doing some accounting there, and you're not sure about how this rule works, first of all, you go to Category A, which are the GASB statements and interpretations. If not, right, you can't, no, it's not there, this is a new special kind of entity, it's really not talked about there, well then you can go to Category B and see if you can figure it out from there. If you can't find something in an authoritative source, you might look at the concept statements, the FASB, AICPA literature. You know, professional organizations often talk about how to do some special accounting treatment for something. You may have a regulatory agency you answer to, and they may just tell you this is how you have to record that transaction. And some practices that have evolved. So if you actually did get into not-for-profit governmental accounting, you would be able to figure it out, probably from the standards, or just as part of your job you would look to some other sources. All right. So there are some concept statements within GAAP, and I'm sure that you have read FASB concept statements when you took intermediate. And they just sort of guide how we develop new standards. In other words, here are the concepts we follow when we create the accounting standards, right? This concept of conservatism, right? That we have to report certain ways, right? That's what a concept is, this concept of why are we doing this? What's the big picture idea behind financial reporting? That's the concept of financial reporting, right? They're not the standards. The standards are derived from these concepts. This concept, we need to fully disclose certain kinds of information. That's a concept. A standard would be, we disclose revenue in this way, right? So there's concepts that we follow to develop standards. And when standards are developed, they are what's called codified, right? They are put into a code. So you could say, here's the book of code, right? It's the word code means the rules. So we've codified the accounting standards, right? GASB, FASB, FASAB, publish codifications. It's just a book, right? You can imagine a book or a place online where you can go and look up standard number 1000.102.f, right? You look up the standard and you read it. So the advantage is they're all together in one spot, and you can look them up and you can refer to them, and you can say, I prepared my financial statements according to the standard, and you can state that standard. Now, the codifications have those subsections, right? Like interpretations, technical bulletins, right? So if you were to go get a book of GASB standards, in fact there's a name for it, it's called the Yellow Book. If you were to go get the GASB standards, you'd get this book and it would just have all these listings by numbers, and you know, I'm certainly not going to expect anybody to learn that. I'm going to expect you to learn these high-level concepts and understand the statements and that, but obviously, if you became a financial accountant for a city or a state or a school district, you might need to go get yourself a copy of the codified GASB standards. Okay? And of course, it would be helpful to learn how to read them. I'm not going to expect anybody to memorize standard numbers or anything like this, but the numbers, if you go look up a codified GASB rule, the numbers mean something, right? So if it's a number 1000 through 1900, those are general principles, right? 2000 through 29, broad, right? Then there's going to be different paragraph numbers that talks about the levels of authorities. So depending on the number, and sometimes some of them have letters, right? If it ends with HO, that's for a hospital, right? They all mean something. I'm not going to ask you to memorize what they all mean, but just know that these numbers and letters for GASB code, the standard, actually mean something. So if you used them a lot, I guess you would learn the standard numbers probably. Concept statements. All of these organizations have concept statements. And again, I already talked about this concept of how and why we're going to report something leads us to what we put in the standard. All right. So FASAB, FASB, GASB all have concept statements, right? The Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board, remember, they just give the advice. They can't make a rule because it's the federal government. The federal government makes all the rules in this country. And so the concept talks about what are our objectives, right? It's not the rule, it's not, but what are our objectives? Oh, we want to, fully disclose, things like that. The entity, what should management talk about? Who's the audience? What are the definitions? What's the basic information, right? So here's the concepts, and then the FASAB will use these concepts to come up with standards, right? So FASB, if you recall, FASB, their standards apply to the not-for-profits, the NFPs, as we're going to call them in this class. So the NFPs, you can imagine things, Doctors Without Borders, United Way, things like that. They have some separate concepts, and the main objective that makes an NFP different from a FP, a for-profit, right? So FASB has the same concepts, right? Conservatism and all these ideas that you've learned before. But the main objective from FASB Concept 4, which applies specifically to not-for-profits, is that you're trying to present useful information, right? And understand who are the primary users. Donors, grantors, and banks are the primary users. GASB has concept statements, and this is where they're letting us know what's important for a city, what's important for a state, a university, something that's a below federal government level government, a school district. So citizens have the right to know why resources are raised and how they'll be used. If you're going to take taxes from me, which is what these entities do, I don't have a choice. If you're going to take taxes from me, I have the right to know where that's going, right? So GASB GASB concept statement 1 is about the objectives. Compare actual with budgeted. Help us understand the results of operations. Show compliance, which is not the same thing as profits, right? Show compliance with laws. Assist in effectiveness and efficiency. All right, concept statement 2. Think about this. What I as a taxpayer am interested in is, hey, are my police catching the bad guys? Are my children getting education in the school? If I'm here at a university, are students graduating? Are they successful in getting jobs when they leave? Right? So these concept statements tell us we have to think about the purpose of the entity and report out non-financial measures too. I mean, that's what people are really interested in, right? How do we communicate it? In basic financial statements, and of course that's the main thing we're going to learn is these GASB financial statements. And concept statement 4 provides key definitions. Surprisingly, it's going to be different, not surprisingly, different from your financial accounting, right? I mean, assets plus liabilities equals stockholders' equity. Wrong for governmental. There's nobody to have equity, right? And assets don't really matter because it doesn't matter how we're using them. What matters is the effect. So we even have some extra accounts like deferred inflows and outflows for resources. So as we start getting into the actual financial statements, keep in mind the purpose, right? Why is the city here? Why is the school here? It helps you keep track of all these funds and these different things. All right. And concept statement number 6 talks about how to measure liabilities, assets. Excuse me, sorry. Because remember, we're not about profits. So the timing of recognizing and using these things is different. All right? Right, so GASB objectives are different from business objectives. A lot more emphasis on budget, right? The budget is just a sign, you have to follow it. There's not this idea that it's flexible, we flex it, we calculate variances, none of that. Here's what you have to spend this year. Legal compliance, efficiency and effectiveness other than net income. There's not net income. Cities may run at losses. They may borrow to stay afloat. There's just not such a thing as this net income. You may have an entity like the water department that charges for stuff, but it's not about earning a profit. All right, so we have to understand what non-financial measures are important. All right, and there are some reports that are required, and of course that's the main point of this class, is we're going to start getting into these financial reports and, you know, how to prepare them. All right, so understanding a couple of different things here that I'm just going to use a city for an example. A city reports, there's going to be management discussion and analysis. So MD&A, like you're used to seeing at the beginning of a 10K or financial report for a for-profit organization, they have those. It may be different, but it exists. There is a basic set of financial statements. However, they're going to be much more detailed, is how I would say it, right? Because if you think about it, for-profit financial statements, they don't want to give away too many details to competitors, right? So they're telling us about their profits and losses, but they don't get quite as detailed with all these separate funds like a governmental entity might. So you're going to have your government-wide financial statements that give the entire kind of like a balance sheet and an income statement would for a corporation, right? We call it a statement of net position and a statement of activities, right? But kind of this idea of government-wide financial statements. And then there's fund-based financial statements. So you can imagine that any government, even a very small town like Kingsville, is going to have, you know, the police they're running. They're going to have the water department. They're going to have street maintenance, on and on and on. Maybe an electric company. Maybe they run the hospital, maybe they don't. So these cities are going to have a lot of different things going on. They're going to issue bonds maybe to build a big new city hall, repair the streets. So they're going to have funds set aside for these different purposes. They're going to have separate little entities working with under the city, right? So you can imagine the water department is its own separate entity that they keep track of their financial statements separately. You can imagine all these years folks have worked for the city of Kingsville and some of them retire. They have a retirement fund probably. So fund accounting is important for cities, school districts, things like that. And we're going to talk about these funds